the vanguard of longevity, original series guest stars still around today. A handful of performers from the original Star Trek run are still with us in 2025, and honestly, that's pretty remarkable given how brutal Hollywood can be. These are the folks who showed up for a single episode or two, and somehow became permanent fixtures in the sci-fi universe. Sherry Jackson played the android Andrea in What Are Little Girls Made Of? And if you've seen that episode, you know exactly why it stuck in people's minds. Jackson was already a veteran by the time she beamed aboard, having spent her childhood playing Danny Thomas's daughter on Make Room for Daddy. She bounced around plenty of other shows after Trek, The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, The Rockford Files. But it was that one episode in the silver costume that people remember most. She's in her early 80s now and still shows up at conventions, which says a lot about her connection to the fans. Julie Newmar, yeah, the original Catwoman, showed up as Aline in Friday's Child, and she was pretty upfront about not really being a sci-fi person. She found the whole genre kind of difficult to work in, which is a refreshingly honest take. What makes Newmar's story interesting is what she did off camera. She's genuinely brilliant. We're talking a tested IQ well north of 130. And she channeled that into patenting her own line of hosiery designed for curvier women. Now in her early 90s, she's still active on social media and doing her thing. She never let herself get boxed into the Hollywood siren corner, and that probably saved her from a lot of the financial struggles that hit her peers. Gary Lockwood has one of the coolest dual legacy situations in all of science fiction. He played Gary Mitchell in the second pilot, basically the first godlike villain the franchise ever produced, and then turned around and starred in 2001, A Space Odyssey for Stanley Kubrick. Not a bad 1-2 punch. He's been pretty candid about the Trek experience not being his favorite, largely because the silver contact lenses they used for Mitchell's transformation were essentially opaque foil that left him completely blind on set. He had to be physically guided around by crew members. He's in his late 80s now, and still makes the convention rounds. Leslie Parrish played Lieutenant Carolyn Palamas in Who Mourns for Adonais, the one where Apollo shows up and gets a little too interested in her character. Before acting, she'd actually worked as a human test pattern for early color TV broadcasts, which is one of the stranger career origin stories you'll find. What's really notable about Parrish is that she walked away from Hollywood deliberately in the late 70s to focus on civil rights and anti-war activism. She organized a group of over 100 public figures, including Leonard Nimoy, to speak out on political issues. Her disappearance from the spotlight wasn't a crash landing. It was a conscious choice, which makes her pretty unique in this crowd. Joan Collins brought genuine Hollywood glamour to the franchise in what many consider the single best episode of the original series, The City on the Edge of Forever. She was already a star when she showed up, and she went on to become the face of Dynasty in the 80s. Now in her early 90s, she's still very much active and very much Joan Collins. Clint Howard holds the unofficial record for most Trek appearances across the most different eras of the franchise. He first showed up as the creepy little Baylock in The Corbomite Maneuver when he was just a kid, and he's been popping up in various Trek productions ever since. He's in his mid-60s and still working regularly. Legal and ethical deviations, the narrative of the wrong turn. Not every Star Trek story has a happy ending, or even a defensible one. Some of the people who passed through this franchise took turns so sharp they're hard to look at directly. Stephen Collins is probably the most jarring case. He played Commander Decker in Star Trek, the motion picture, and for decades after that he was the guy America trusted, literally playing a minister on Seventh Heaven. Then in 2014, he admitted to sexually abusing minors. His career ended immediately and permanently. Co-stars from his other projects had to publicly distance themselves from him. He hasn't worked in the industry since, and the shadow he cast over his own legacy is about as dark as it gets. The contrast between the wholesome authority figure he projected on screen and what he admitted to off it is genuinely difficult to process. Jennifer Lean played Kez on Star Trek, Voyager, and her story is one of the sadder ones in the franchise's history. She was written off the show partway through its run after reportedly becoming unreliable on set, and things deteriorated significantly from there. Over roughly a decade, she racked up a string of arrests, domestic violence, DUI, evading arrest, indecent exposure, that painted a picture of someone in serious crisis with no real support system catching her. The entertainment industry is notoriously bad at looking after people once they're no longer useful to it, and Lean's situation is a pretty stark example of that failure. Lawrence Tierney played the holodeck gangster Cyrus Redblock in The Next Generation, and it was genuinely a case of art imitating life. Tierney was a legendary tough guy from 1940s noir cinema, but his real-life reputation for violence and heavy drinking followed him everywhere. He had dozens of arrests over the years, bar fights, public drunkenness, altercations with cops. On set, whether it was Trek, Seinfeld, or Reservoir Dogs, he was known for being intimidating, unpredictable, and not particularly interested in following scripts. There's a story from the 1950s about him kicking a police officer hard enough to put the guy on the ground, which kind of tells you everything you need to know. His talent was undeniable, but his volatility meant his career was always a fraction of what it could have been. Professional hardships, the toll of typecasting and exploitation. The Federation might run on a post-scarcity economy, but the people who brought it to life were very much subject to the financial realities of 20th century Hollywood, and some of them got a pretty raw deal. Wil Wheaton has been remarkably open about how difficult his time as Wesley Crusher actually was. He's described being essentially forced into acting by his parents, emotional pressure from his father, manipulation from his mother, and despite being a teen idol on a massively successful show, he saw very little of the money his image generated. By the time he was an adult, he was far from wealthy and ended up taking a regular desk job just to get some distance from the whole thing. He eventually found his footing again as a kind of internet-era cult hero, but the damage from those early years was real and lasting. Grace Lee Whitney played Yeoman Rand in the first season of the original series and was being heavily promoted as a female lead, and then she was abruptly let go halfway through the season. The official reason was budget cuts, but Whitney later alleged that she had been sexually assaulted by a high-ranking studio executive and that her dismissal came after she tried to address it. The fallout sent her into years of substance abuse. She eventually got sober, became an advocate for recovery, and came back to the franchise for cameos and conventions. But the interruption of her career at that moment remains one of the franchise's most painful what-ifs. Jerry Ryan joined Voyager as Seven of Nine and immediately became one of the most popular characters on the show, which created a genuinely hostile work environment. She's described feeling physically sick before going to work because of the resentment from some cast members who felt pushed aside by her arrival. She eventually moved past it, Boston Public, Bosch, and a long, successful career. But those early years on the show were rough in ways that had nothing to do with the Borg. Systemic tragedies, accidents, health, and the Star Trek curse. Some of the hardest stories in Trek history aren't about bad choices or industry exploitation. They're just about bad luck and the fragility of human life. Anton Yelchin died in 2016 at just 27 years old in a freak accident at his own home. His Jeep rolled back down his driveway and pinned him against a security fence, a defect that had actually been flagged in a recall. He died just before Star Trek Beyond came out, and the film was dedicated to him. What made it even more heartbreaking was the posthumous revelation that Yelchin had been quietly dealing with cystic fibrosis throughout his entire rising career. He never made a big deal of it. He just kept working. Merritt Butrick played David Marcus, Kirk's son, in The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock, and delivered some of the most emotionally resonant scenes in the film series. He died in 1989 at just 29 from complications related to AIDS. His name appears on the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, with panels that reference his Star Trek role. His death was part of a wave of losses during the height of the epidemic that took an enormous toll on the creative community. Beyond those two, the franchise has lost a striking number of performers to illness and accident at relatively young ages: heart attacks, cancer, brain hemorrhages. The list is long enough that the phrase Star Trek curse has floated around in fan circles for decades. Sociologically, it's less a curse and more a reflection of the physical and psychological toll of working in a high-pressure industry, combined with the era's limited medical resources and the particular vulnerability of performers who often lacked financial stability or health coverage once their contracts ended. The industry paradox. Gene Roddenberry's influence. You can't talk about wrong turns in the Star Trek universe without at least acknowledging the complicated legacy of the man who built it. Gene Roddenberry created one of the most progressive humanistic visions in television history, and by multiple accounts from people who worked with him, he could be a pretty difficult person in his private life. Former colleagues have described him as manipulative and prone to using his position of power to pursue relationships with actresses and staff. His personal relationships with Majel Barrett and Nichelle Nichols were well known within the production. He was also criticized for pushing female performers toward increasingly revealing costumes in ways that seemed to serve his own preferences more than the story. In his later years, he struggled with alcohol and drug abuse. None of this erases what he built, but it does complicate the image of the enlightened visionary, which is probably the most honest way to hold it. Fandom as a mechanism of redemption, the Angelique Pettyjohn arc. Angelique Pettyjohn played the drill thrall Shauna in The Gamesters of Triskelion, and her story is one of the more nuanced ones in the franchise's history. After Trek, she struggled to find mainstream work and eventually ended up in adult films in the late 70s and early 80s, something she later attributed to poor self-esteem and substance abuse issues. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The rise of the convention circuit in the 80s gave her a genuine second act. Her episode was a fan favorite, which meant she was in real demand at events. She leaned into it, used the income to stabilize her life, and by her own account, the fan community played a meaningful role in helping her get clean. She died of cancer in 1992, but the final chapter of her life was one of recovery and genuine connection with the people who loved her work. It's a good reminder that fandom isn't just nostalgia, Sometimes it's actually a lifeline. Sociocultural implications of the Star Trek curse. The Star Trek curse makes for good tabloid copy, but what it actually describes is something more mundane and more systemic. The way a single high-profile appearance in a cult franchise can become both a calling card and a cage. For a lot of guest stars, that one episode became the defining moment of their public identity, making it genuinely hard to get cast in anything that required audiences to see them differently. Combine that with the fact that many early performers received no residuals, meaning the show could run in syndication forever and they'd see nothing from it. And you get a pretty precarious existence for anyone who didn't have the business instincts of a Julie Newmar or the breakout trajectory of a Joan Collins. The wrong turns documented here aren't unique to Star Trek, but they hit differently against the backdrop of a show that was explicitly about a better, fairer world. When someone who played a scientist or a hero in that world ends up struggling with addiction or homelessness or legal trouble, the contrast is hard to ignore.